All right, what's up, guys? We're back today with what is this, four for us, three here of the podcast. That's not a podcast, which is just kind of the slogan at this point. Again, like Max LePage, I live in Philly, Pennsylvania. I'm a physical therapist at Precision Performance Physical Therapy now. And I'm talking with my good friends, Chad and Logan from TriFit Barbell down in South Carolina. So we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff, a little bit on kind of movement, prep, technique, whether or not it's important for that stuff to be perfect and crisp for you to actually train hard. We're going to talk a little bit about the growth or lack of growth of calves, and then talk a
It's
little bit about
impossible.
some dogmas in training and whether or not you should abide by a certain philosophy or system and be married to that, or if you should be flexible about looking at other stuff. So yeah, that's kind of what's on the agenda, and then I'm sure we'll kind of riff off of that and go from there. So first off, what's the update with you guys? How's TriFit doing this past couple weeks?
Yeah, man, doing good. I think schools are starting to reopen. People are trying to get back in the swing of things. The weather was super fantastic yesterday, so it's been really nice in the gym. Finally,
Are you
it's
guys at
funny,
a
like 80.
capacity limit?
We do, but it we haven't gotten near hitting it. So
Okay,
Yeah, it hasn't been an issue yet, you know.
yeah,
nice.
So yeah, but
um,
things have been good at
yeah.
the gym. It's been like today, things were consistent. It's like it's funny. Every time it gets really busy, there'll be a moment where I'll remember 3 years ago when I could get in like two workouts every morning and not see a single person. Like there was just nothing else to do,
Right.
you know. So I would clean, I would organize, and then I'd just, all right, I guess I'll go do more bicep curls. But like now, that's just not a thing. I just like ran through a 30-minute bench routine, and that was all I had time for.
So I
Of
feel like
course, you
everyone, when they think about opening a gym, part of the equation is like, dude, I'll own a gym, so I'm going to have somewhere to lift all the time. It'll be so easy to train. Do you feel like that's true, or is it harder now because you have people pulling you in different directions all the time?
Well, I feel like at the beginning, sure, totally, because we didn't have much else going on. I mean, there were, you know, me and Logan were trying to tackle things. We were coming up with ideas, but the gym was still growing, and there was so many things that we didn't know that we could do. Our social media wasn't really a thing yet. We didn't realize how important it was. So there was just a lot more free time. But like now, it's like, you know, there's almost always someone to help, and I feel like if I'm taking a 2 hour workout, could I have spent 2 hours working at something else? You know, there's probably something here I could have been doing, posting content, reaching out to clients, writing programs. Like I wrote like 10 programs this morning, you know?
Yeah.
So
Dude, it's weird. Yeah, like back in, when you first started, it's like you have the time to train, and it's like you're in that like new phase where, oh, this is new and I get to work out all the time. But it's like as you get into the business and the business grows, it's like, oh no, I should be spending, maybe I'm in my business building. It's no longer like quite as much just this free play area. It's now this place where there's constantly people to help out and things to do and things to check in on.
Yeah.
Um, so like the mindset just changes as you go through it. But
Yeah, I feel like I would almost develop like a sense of guilt if I was like doing anything else in the facility that's not productive. I would almost feel like I should be doing something else because this is my place of business, when in reality it's also like just a place that you hang out and work or and
yeah,
work out.
you have to like do like 7 hour workouts where it's like one set every hour.
Yeah.
yeah,
That sounds
100%.
terrible. That's
Yeah.
like the number one thing to disprove the people out there in the rehab world who say you need this long, thorough warm up. Just talk to you guys, a gym owner who is
That's right.
warmed up all day.
Every set is a warm up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No kidding.
Um, all right. So Logan, you had those kind of topics offhand. Which
Yeah.
one do you want to start with? What do you want to talk about?
Let's so the idea was form and technique. I think we've been with the dawn of social media, it's easy for us to kind of pick apart form and technique on people's lifts, and it's a question that I had was like we should always, and we'll kind of jump in on this together, but should we always chase perfection? Because we should always kind of train with the mindset of like, let me do this as perfectly as possible. Because I know we've preached for a minute like practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. So is it necessary to be perfect all the time? Is it something you should always, should perfection in your technique trump anything else you ever try for? And is there a moment where it's like, well, we can't have perfect technique because we're just learning, or it's a max effort lift and if form's not breaking, were you even going perfect? So I'd love to hear like a physical therapy perspective, and then we can jump in with kind of our philosophies on it.
Yeah, I want to hear Max's first so that I can chime in and be like, yeah, I feel all of that too.
Yeah. I mean, there's kind of two inherent difficulties when you have that conversation about technique, and especially when you're trying to relate it to injury. So you have to kind of separate in your mind. Am I talking about technique relative to injury, or am I talking about technique relative to performance? Because you can have a technique that will potentially put you in a quote unquote safer position, and that can be argued, but you can also have that technique might not be also the one that produces the greatest performance. So an example would be an Olympic weightlifter, their knees might collapse into significant valgus in the bottom of when they catch a snatch or a clean. And some might argue that that may predispose them to injury, in the sense that their body won't be able to adapt to those loads progressively over time quite as well as it could to a position where maybe their joints are a little bit better stacked and the distribution of force is a little bit more even throughout a joint. And so they're going to hit this kind of adaptive ceiling with that technique. And so that's putting them technically at a higher risk of injury as compared to one where their knees are in a good position. But then the issue is their knees being in a quote unquote good position isn't necessarily what allows them to produce the most force. So if you were to change their position into that, you're potentially sacrificing a little bit of strength on their catch of the snatch or on their cleans, or a powerlifter on their squat. So you have to ask yourself, it's always a balancing of risk reward. And for each individual athlete, they have to identify what's the level of risk that I'm willing to accept versus the level of reward. And if an Olympic, I mean, look, I think I saw there was a survey that's been kind of popularized that said 4 out of 5 Olympic athletes would accept a guaranteed death in 5 years if they knew that they were guaranteed to win a gold medal.
That's a crazy metric. Yeah.
I'm sure I'm misquoting that metric, but it's something in the order of magnitude of insanity at that level.
Yeah.
Sure.
Essentially suggesting that, like, look, these guys are willing to risk a lot more than just a knee injury. So in that person, I'm probably going to have a different thought process in terms of what I need to do from a form standpoint. But that's just the issue from injury versus performance. Now I have to get into two separate issues. Those two separate issues are, can we determine if a movement predisposes you to injury? And can we even agree on what movement we would consider perfect? So there's kind of 3 layers of things we have to settle here. What predisposes you to injury? What doesn't? So what's perfect? And then do we even care, or are we willing to accept the trade-off for performance if that's there? And the reality is, if you go to 100 different PT clinics, or you go to 100 different strength and conditioning facilities, they're all going to have a different, very slightly different idea of what a perfect squat would be. And unfortunately, that idea has to be molded to a variety of unique individuals, all of which have their own perfect squat technique. And there's no way to know what is perfect for one person compared to what is perfect for the next person. So the idea of perfection as being a landmark that we can actually reach is in itself flawed, because it's each individual's perfect is different. And no one has established or can really establish what is going to be perfect based on the unique individual in the first place. And then we don't have enough to really say that any imperfect, quote unquote, and we can kind of get an idea of like, okay, this is probably on average worse or better than this other thing. But even in those instances where we look at a movement where we're like, this looks terrible, we really don't have any good evidence to suggest that most instances where we think that something looks terrible actually correlates with injury very well. The instances where we know like, okay, this causes injury is like dynamic knee valgus in an athletic movement like cutting, or you get these non-contact injuries in a football player when they cut, their knee goes into valgus, internal rotation, and they're in that position for an ACL tear. That's the unique instance where it's like, okay, this position under these loads causes this injury. And we can even argue about whether we can change that position in the first place or whether we can allow the person to better handle that position. But that's one of the only instances where we're like, all right, this position causes this injury. In no other circumstance do we really have
So
that.
I just want to make clear there. So is there really not enough data other than this ACL tear when we're cutting to say definitively that there is a movement that causes direct harm to you, almost guaranteed?
I really can't think of any diagnosis or any specific injury where I can confidently say this position causes this injury, with the exception of the ACL tear. And then you can probably mix in conjecture. Like most hamstring strains are probably going to occur in a position where the hamstring's lengthened, right? So the follow through of a soccer kick where your hip is flexed, your knees extended forcefully at both ends, there you're probably going to see the mechanism for a hamstring strain. But there's people who kick soccer balls all the time. Most of the time they don't get hamstring strains. So you can't demonize the position. Just because that's the position that most people have injuries in doesn't mean that that position's dangerous, because it's actually a necessity for the sport. So really, other than the ACL tear where the valgus foot planted internal rotation, that position is not necessary for the sport like a follow through on a kick is for soccer. So in that one instance, we can say like, hey, we either need to try to avoid this position or we need to try to develop physical qualities that protect us against that position. So learning to land with deeper knee flexion or with having stronger quad, those things can be helpful. But yeah, that's really the only place. So they'll do other research on, say, lumbar, and there's a great resource on this if you go to, it's kind of like written a little bit more for the lay person on Stronger by Science's website. That's Greg Nuckols' website. And it's, is lumbar flexion bad for you, or is lumbar flexion bad, or something along those lines. And it's written by a PT called Sam Spinell, and he does a good job of referencing all the literature on this. But you'll look at studies that look at lumbar flexion in a cadaver, and then they put the lumbar spine in a certain position, they put forces through the lumbar spine, and then they say like, okay, what is the mechanical threshold or the failure rate of the vertebral discs with certain newtons of force and in a certain position. And what you essentially end up coming down to is there is reason to suggest that a certain amount of force in a flexed position is going to cause tissues to fail. Just like if I get hit by a car or I jump out of a plane without a parachute, like I am going to die, or I'm going, my tissues are going to be deformed. So there's certainly, with anything, enough force on a certain tissue, you're going to exceed its capacity and it's going to fail. So you do see failure rates in those studies when they look at the lumbar, their intervertebral discs in positions of flexion versus extension. But what you see is that the failure rates really don't differ all that much between flexed, neutral, extended. And so then you're led to kind of suggest like, okay, well, it seems like, yes, they fail in a flex spine, but they also fail in a neutral spine, quote unquote, and they do fail in an extended spine. And this study's results are a little bit different than this study's, all the while recognizing that this is in a cadaver with zero active kind of counter forces. So there's no muscles here counteracting the forces placed on it. So how much you can extrapolate that is debatable anyways. But so the long answer to your question is no, there's no real direct correlation where you can infer or demonstrate causation between a position and a specific injury, apart from those kind of very unique ACL type ligamentous injuries.
So like, I think it's one of those things that there's this mindset that's a binary thing. It's either you do it right or you get injured. And I think anecdotally, that's just not the case. I mean, how many people have we seen where, their form isn't perfect on a particular lift and they walk away injury free, happier than ever,
Have you guys seen some of these, like, I don't even know what they call themselves. I don't even know if they have a specific title, like strength and conditioning coaches, but there's this whole following that I've seen online, social media, where these guys purposefully do exercises that to what most people consider like, hey, that is done incorrectly. Like they do super dramatically curved deadlifts and then take and slowly work through each spinal erector muscle until they're fully erect. And they'll do it under decent loads. I mean, they're doing nothing near what they probably could if they stabilize their spine, brace their core muscles. But it's really interesting. Some of these guys that I'll follow, and I'll try to forward these gentlemen to you guys just so you can kind of see them, but they work through all these different planes and they argue about like, quit closing training into a box, that this is the way training always should be. If it's not, this exercise is done this way, anything else is high risk, blah, blah, blah. So it can be frustrating because of course you want to be able to coach in a manner that it's like, yes, you do it this way, less risk of injury. But it's like more times than not, I feel like it's always, okay, well, how have you been training? How, what is your history? If you have a pretty good history of training in a certain position, it's like, yeah, that's not necessarily what I would recommend. Like I would move my feet out, I would position my knees like this maybe, but people can get strong with what most people would say, hey, that's not good form. It's like, but he's practiced it over and over again for years, so he's gotten really good with quote unquote bad form.
Yeah, I mean, so much of it is like, what are you adapted to? And I've seen people have done that same thing with ACLs, actually, even in like this dynamic valgus landing position where a strength conditioning coach for a college will have his football or basketball players jump off of a box and land with an intentionally valgus knee position, because the thought process is like, well, if you're going to get in this position in the game and I don't have a good way to stop you from getting into that position, even getting your hips stronger, that stuff doesn't necessarily correlate to actual changes in motion when you're in split second, like trying to cut to stop and tackle someone. Like you're not thinking about, oh, keep my knee in line with my toe. So those things tend not to work. So their thought process is, well, if you're going to be in this position, we might as well progressively load you in that position and get your ACL quote unquote stronger.
Did you guys see this? Mass covered, sorry, Max, I don't mean to cut you off, but it just reminds me, Greg Nuckols covered a study that was done, and what they did with weightlifters, they purposely gave them bad cues in their lifting. So they do like the opposite. Like let's say they've got a lot of thoracic rotation, like they're just curved forward. They told them to make it worse, make it more dramatic. And by doing so, the athlete sometimes would, oh, okay, well, that's what I want you to do. I want you to do the opposite. Is it kind of like that? Like, hey, if you implement bad training cues, could it cause the opposite effect? And I read just the Mass review, so I didn't go into the study, but I don't know if you saw that, like what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So that's looking more at like the effectiveness of, should we cue someone and tell them what to do, or should we show them what not to do and then they'll know what it feels like to do the thing wrong? So if you were trying to teach someone, like you said, how to deadlift, and your goal is to get them in more of a neutral spine, telling them to get in a neutral spine might not be as effective as telling them to round their back as hard as they can and then just say, don't do that anymore. Because then they know what it feels like to do it wrong,
Yeah.
So
Does
that's
it
looking,
hurt? Good. Don't do it again.
yeah, exactly. So that's looking more at like, okay, how should we cue people? Should we give them positive reinforcement, or should we give them kind of this negative reinforcement in a sense? But what the coaches who do the kind of positional drills where they jump into those positions, they're genuinely trying to get tissues to adapt to quote unquote bad positions or more vulnerable positions. And this is where I kind of separate from the people who I've seen rehab professionals and kind of people in the strength conditioning world go in and do like what you were describing, like a Jefferson curl, right? Where you're completely rounding your back and then you're essentially doing like a full global spinal extension with a bar in your hands or with a kettlebell or whatever it is. And you're doing this massive flexion and then you're just extending your spine, rolling it. So you're definitely training your erector spinae all across your back. And the idea is like, okay, well, I'm getting stronger in these positions, so I'll be less vulnerable when I get there. And that people extrapolate that to say, well, your spine position in the deadlift doesn't matter, because if we get strong in that position, and these studies show that there's not a huge advantage to flexion versus extension versus neutral in terms of the ceiling or the capacity of those passive structures like the ligaments and the discs, then I take these two pieces of knowledge and I put them together. That means form doesn't matter at all. And I think that there's this concept of adaptive tissues, adaptive ceilings. And this is where I tend to separate from that kind of alternative extreme pack of folks who think the form doesn't matter, and land somewhere in the middle of like, okay, I think it does matter, but maybe not as much as the perfect group and a little bit more than the group who says it doesn't matter at all. And that's, again, this concept of adaptive ceilings. So when we look at a certain position, let's just take the knee, for example. Your knee on a squat in, say, good or normal mechanics for you at this point in time today, it has a minimal it has a minimal effective dose for creating changes, getting stronger cartilage adaptations, stronger ligamentous tissues, stronger musculature around, and you have a maximal recoverable volume. Just like a muscle has a maximal recoverable volume in terms of the amount of leg extensions it can handle, your passive structures can be thought of in the same way. So there's a certain ceiling where if you exceed that tissue's capacity, and we'll just say the cartilage in this circumstance, you exceed the cartilage's capacity, well, you're going to potentially get an inflammatory response. Things are going to be irritated. They're going to be aggravated. And now you've exceeded that capacity. If we hang out below the maximal recoverable volume and we slowly progress from there, well, now that tissue's capacity or its ceiling, you're going to be able to push it up a little bit more, right? And now the tissues are going to be able to handle a little bit more. Your knee cartilage, as someone who's progressively squatted to the point that they can squat in the mid 500s, its ceiling is higher than someone who's just stepping foot into the gym for the first time, even if they have the same kind of biological structure as you, the same joint size, like your twin who's never lifted but is biologically identical. They don't have a tissue capacity that's the same as you who's adapted to those stressors. But we cannot expect our tissues' adaptive capacity to be infinite in its ability to recover from stress and to raise its capacity even further. So there's a point in time where we're going to max out how much can we really load this. Even if we're so incrementally progressive and we do it appropriately, you're going to reach a time where, okay, this tissue has maxed out its capacity. We don't know where that is, but we can start to have thought processes that lead us to think that maybe one position is going to be more conducive to having a higher ceiling than another position. So an example could be if someone squats, say with their knees really far out, like they're just trying to push their knees out, their weight is kind of on the outer edge of their feet. And through some of the biomechanical studies, we know that that puts more of the force distribution on that lateral outside edge of the tibial plateau and femoral condyles. So if we are reducing the area under which the same amount of pressure goes through, probably we're going to limit our adaptive ceiling to some degree because we are applying more force on a smaller area. And that doesn't mean that we can't progressively load that and improve that. And maybe that can carry us to a 400-pound squat with a certain amount of volume per week. And we can get to that strength without ever having any knee problems because we are still within its adaptive capacity. But because we've chosen this technique or this form that predisposes us to having a limited ceiling because of the narrow window where we're distributing forces, we won't be able to get to that 500-pound squat without probably running into some issues unless we shift to a different movement pattern that allows us room to raise our ceiling. And so in that instance, now we start to think about like, okay, what technique is better than this one? And for that individual, a better one will be different than for someone who, say, is valgus inside of their foot, really jamming the medial side of their knee. They need the opposite cue as the other person. So the opposite cue will fix one person as compared to the other person based on what they've adapted to so far, what their training history is like, what their capacity is, and where they're trying to kind of progress to. So it's the same thing with a low back situation where it's like, okay, I can do these Jefferson curls with a super flex spine, but probably my adaptive ceiling is going to be lower than with a deadlift braced neutral spine. That doesn't mean that the first movement is bad, and that doesn't even mean that you shouldn't do it. But your expectations for how much can I load this over time needs to be oriented around what kind of performance or what capacity do I really think that I can get out of this movement. And probably for most people, like if you're going to train long term and try to load something to get as strong as possible, you probably want to find a position or a style of movement for you that we think can maximize your potential capacity in that kind of movement. Does that make sense?
Oh, dude, absolutely. And I think that like it's specific to the person, whatever the form may be at the time. And as the coach, it's one of those things that, or as the athlete yourself, if you're looking into your training and how to improve, you should always say to yourself that if I'm hitting a point where I'm causing pain or I'm not able to progress, then something needs to change. And maybe that lies within the technique that you've presently chosen and that needs to change. Or maybe it's in the movement, the exercise selection, whatever it is. And I think you might have said it yourself, but I know Chad and I are always saying it because we'll pick two sides of an argument and then we always just lead ourselves toward the center and we realize the answer lies somewhere in the center. So it's not so much that form is either good nor bad, it's that you're working with this particular thing. And over time, that needs to adapt to your level and to where you want to go with it. What's the end game here? Is it just a maximum effort lift or is it just building some muscle?
Right.
Yeah,
No.
I agree with both of you. It's when it comes to like, is form good or bad? Logan said it perfectly. Like, I feel like, especially in our particular type of training, what we're trying to do for a lot of people is building like confidence. People come in, they want to be stronger. Strength can boost confidence in and outside of the gym. Aesthetics, they want to look better. Again, boosting confidence in and outside of the gym. So words like good and bad, like is like, I mean, we're not children. We don't have to be like, okay, we can't talk about these things, but we can. It's like when you're throwing around like your form was bad, so it's not good. Like you suck, you need to do better. It's like your form was fine for where we are now. Are we going to try to improve it? Hell yeah. Are we going to work at this every day? what are your goals? Do you want to get stronger? Then yeah, we need to optimize position. Like we need to explore some positions that will potentially open up a window of strength that you maybe didn't know about. We get CrossFitters all the time that it's like, they had one style of squatting, because in a group setting like that, you typically pick a style of movement, you stick with it for most of your training there. You probably rarely ever explore high bar, low bar, wide stance, narrow stance. It's just, hey, we're doing squats today. And that's fine. Squatting is better than never squatting. But in here, we have the opportunity to, if we have athletes that's like, hey, I really want to get stronger. It's like, okay, well, why don't we explore different positions? Let's see if moving the bar lower on your shoulders, you're able to stabilize upper back better. So exploration and encouraging them to stick with good form 99% of the time. If form is breaking down all the time, there's a couple different scenarios I'm thinking. One, we're probably moving too much weight, too aggressively, too quick. Because even if you throw every good cue at somebody, if it's not sticking, you're either overwhelming them with information or you're overwhelming them with load. But then you get athletes that say, hey, I actively just want to get bigger. I want to grow muscle. It's like, okay, for you, we're going to tiptoe around this line of your form needs to be good, but we also need to get pretty damn close, if not to failure, but we're going to be doing stuff like bicep curl, push-ups, sit-ups, stuff that you can train, but your risk of injury is pretty small. I'm not going to have somebody load up a squat and have them squat to failure, but I may have them do a wall sit to failure. Minimal risk, great reward, So ask the athletes, like, where do we want to go with training? Make sure it's specific. Make sure it's like, do you feel comfortable in this position? Do you feel like you're getting stronger? Can we explore? Can we, it's trial and error. Trying to go in and just be like, everybody needs a squat, wide stance and low bar and blah, blah. They'll get the best out of their squat. It's like, that's not true. There's weightlifters that do high bar, narrow stance, and they can smoke 600 plus like it's nothing. So, using general terms and like, hey, this is the only way to bench, this is the only way to squat. It's like, no, that's not true. If we go and, we've had athletes like max out, oh, my form wasn't as good. It's like, you're absolutely right. That's why it was a 1 rep max. Are we going to do that all the time? No. In here, we test the minimum 3 months. I push people 6 months or more. The longer time they train, the better. But it's like, all right, on that one day, are we going to sacrifice form a little bit? Just a little bit. But this gives us an opportunity to be like, okay, are you having knee valgus? Okay, if so, what does that tell me? If we push you to that max, we can also learn a great deal about the athlete. Like, okay, when she's doing 70% for reps, form's not breaking down. She's in control. Now, if we push 95, 98, 100%, okay, knees are collapsing, shoulders are starting to lose position. These are areas that we can work on in our training now that we're done testing. So it gives me an opportunity to be like, okay, you need to work on this, this, and this. Stuff that I won't see when they're doing a barbell,
Right.
So.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, it's interesting. Like my metric for like a gym PR, and because we have a bunch of USAPL and USPA competitors, and it's like they always want the referee. Did that get the whites? And it's like, that was probably the nastiest deadlift I've ever seen, but like it would have gotten whites, sure.
Yeah.
But it's like, so my metric for like gym PRs is, did you lift it? Yes. Did you walk away without pain? Yes. But then it was a good lift. What do you like? Why are you asking me? Was that a good lift? Was that a bad lift? It's like, well, I mean, like for all the reasons we've said here, it was a lift. I mean, you did it, are you here just to stroke the ego, or are we trying to discern from information from this 1 rep attempt? And it's like, okay, now we see where your weaknesses are, and we'll go train those, and we'll bring those up, and you'll be in better position throughout. And then that max, when you come back, you'll be stronger at it. So I just find it interesting that there's always that idea of like, it's either good or it's bad. And
that's the dichotomous nature of humans.
The dichotomous nature of humans. I need that on a t-shirt.
Yeah.
It's like, I used to be such and I think I'm trying to be better about growing out of it. I think I was worse about it when I was, when me and Logan, like personally training 6-7 years ago, where I would see a trainer put someone through an exercise, and nobody that we necessarily worked at, but just in general, you go through other gyms, see a trainer having an athlete do something, and inherently you're just like, wow, whatever they're doing, that's dumb. But I know nothing about why they're having to do it. Like, I'm sure I've made athletes do things in here that some people that don't know my reasoning behind it are like, why the hell would Chad have them do that? That seems insane. It's like, well, no, come ask me. Because if I got a good reason for it, then it's not necessarily bad. There may be a method like we talked about. Maybe I'm purposely making them do something the opposite so they understand that I want them to go a different direction, you know? But trying not to just like, you on social media, it's so easy to be like, what the hell is that trainer making them do that and this and that? And it's like, well, we have no idea what led up to that point. Like I got a video forwarded to me of LeBron James doing some squatting. And yes, okay. He had the most aggressively wide stance. So the guy's 6'8". So knees inside of feet, basically doing like a good morning squat, somewhat variation, like dramatic, very lightweight, but looking at it, it's just like, yes, if someone knew how squats should kind of look, they want to see good depth. They want to see, knees over feet, blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, that didn't look like a good squat. But again, maybe that wasn't the reason. Like LeBron James has the best coaches in the world helping him. Guarantee whoever told him to do that for that specific reason. And I don't know what that reason was,
Yeah. Dude, that's something I think we came to recently and recently probably within maybe the past year or two of kind of our careers is I'll have new people come up and ask me like, oh, wasn't that a terrible lift? And it's like, dude, we have no idea why they were doing that. I'm sure their coach had reason for it. Go ask them like, hey, why did you do it that way? One, you'll learn something. Two, maybe he has a reason. And three, if he has no reason for doing it that way and you think you can help that person, maybe don't give unsolicited advice, but maybe just offer your idea on why we wouldn't want to do that or something of that way. It's just,
yeah, totally.
There's no reason.
So we only have about 70 seconds left because our meeting time is going to get cut short by Zoom because we don't have the upgrade to pro. We're still amateurs here. I know. Broke amateurs. No, I'll have pro soon, but in 10 seconds each, that's all you get, 10 seconds. Just tell me why calves don't grow, and then we're going to sign off.
They were put on your body by the devil, and they should be ignored just like you would Satan himself.
All right.
Because only the strong get big calves.
Oh my God, I'm out.
All right. That concludes this meeting. It was good talking to you guys, and look forward to the next one.
Yep.
Awesome.
See y'all next
See
week,
you boys.